Okay. So I would like to welcome you all to the seventh session of our ETHNOGRAFEIN. This year's theme is dedicated to borders, boundaries revisited, anthropological perspective and public engagement. Today we have the honor to have a guest speaker from Georgia and Austria, as he was telling us, Florian Muehlfried. He is a professor of social anthropology at Ilia State University. He has done extensive fieldwork in the Caucasus and other places of the world. He has published several monographs and papers. Some of them I'm going to mention. So his monograph, Mistrust, a Global Perspective, and which is going to be published in Greek as well. Being a State and States of Being in Highland, Georgia, in 2014, and also he co-edited volumes dedicated to sacred places, emerging spaces, religious pluralism in the post-Soviet Caucasus in 2018, and exploring the age of empire, Soviet-era anthropology in the Caucasus and Central Asia, 2011. Today's paper is entitled The Georgian-Russian Border, Perspective from the Periphery. So, Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eleni, for the invitation and for the kind introduction. It feels very cozy to be here with you. Some of you I know quite well and for quite a long time, so it's really a pleasure talking to you today. By the way, Eleni, you mentioned this book about mistrust I have been writing, and it is actually already published in Greek, so I will use it as an opportunity to show you the book, right? And initially, I kind of wanted to hijack my presentation to talk about the book and to do some promotion for the book, but then I realized that the real topic of the presentation series is borders. So I revisited some previous fieldwork of mine, which is situated at the border between Georgia and the Russian Federation. And I decided to focus on this topic for my presentation here, because I guess it's more adequate than talking about mistrust. But I still strongly encourage you to take a look at the Greek version of the book on mistrust that I'm very proud of, actually. So yes, let's switch topic and let's talk about borders. And let me do so by sharing my PowerPoint presentation with you, which I will do right now. Okay, and please let me know if you can see the slides. You can see the slides, you can still hear me, everything is in order, right? Yeah. Okay, very nice. So let me first of all show you a map, because I am not sure how many of you are really acquainted with this strange place we call the Caucasus. So you see the Caucasus here as points of reference. I would always use the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and we have this mountainous strip between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea that we call the Caucasus. To the south of the Caucasus, we have three nowadays independent republics, namely Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. To the north, we have the Russian Federation. Now, actually, friends of mine who live in the northern part of the Caucasus, they are very unhappy if this is called Russia or if this is called the Russian Caucasus, because they insist that although they are politically part of the Russian Federation, they nevertheless have their own history and a very distinct sense of identity. So this is why I talk of the belonging of the North Caucasus to the Russian Federation. And for simplicity's sake, let me simply point out that we have republics such as Dagestan and Chechnya on the northern side of the Caucasus, and some of them are bordering this region of Georgia I will focus on in my presentation. And this region is called Tusheti, and you can see it here. I don't know if you can see the arrow. So when I'm moving something on the screen, can you see the arrow? Okay, so this is Tusheti. And before I introduce Tusheti as a region, I would like to say a few words about the framework of the research, about the fieldwork I've been conducting in this region. This is how I came to know and to like Nesche, by the way, because it's been associated to the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology that I have been affiliated with by that time. And Nesche was affiliated because of her affiliation, I guess, of friendship with Lale Yalcin-Heckmann, who was the director of the research group I have been working in. Now, Lale Yalcin-Heckmann has been leading a group that was called Caucasus Boundaries and Citizenship from Below. And this title already is quite indicative of our main concerns. So first of all, we were interested in boundaries and borders. And this is very much what I will primarily talk about today. Secondly, we were interested in issues of citizenship and how citizenship as a practice relates to the shifting border regimes in the Caucasus. So it's really the shifting border regimes in the Caucasus that we have been interested in as a phenomenon, or rather as phenomena, because there is a multitude of shifting borders in the Caucasus. What do I mean with that? First of all, let me talk about another border. So it's not the border I will focus on today. This is the border between nowadays Georgia and Turkey that you can see here. And this, by the way, is a border that Nesche is very, very familiar with, right? I mean, I think most of her field work is situated on the Turkish side, close to Armenia, but she has also done some field work close to Georgia. And I think by that time, Nesche was very much interested in the pipeline, or rather the pipelines. So this border between Georgia and Turkey has been a very hard border in Soviet times, of course, because it demarcated from a Soviet perspective the western border of the Soviet Union, which means that the Soviet Union here was bordering a capitalist state, namely Turkey, which also meant that this was really a very hard border, very difficult to transgress. And families living on the two sides of the borders that have been relatives, for example, Lars families, have been separated for centuries. So we were interested in the effects of the opening of this border. But we were also interested in the effects of the closing of certain borders or the hardening of certain borders. And with this, I come to my field site, Tusheti, which is a region here in the borderlands of Georgia, as I said, nowadays bordering the Russian Federation, more precisely Chechnya to the north and Dagestan to the east. And this, of course, this border used to be an intrastate border in Soviet times. It was a border within the Soviet Union. It was not an international border. And at times it has been hardly administered or administrated. And as I will elaborate in my presentation, it turned out to be a real hard border nowadays. And now it's very difficult to transgress this border. And this has very immediate implications on the large scale on economy and politics, but also on a not so large scale for the life of citizens who are living next to these borders. So I was doing field work in Tusheti to understand the implication of Georgian citizens residing in the border area to the Russian Federation of the hardening of the border. That is pretty much the background of my study. Now, I was also intensively investigating the Soviet time and how this region was developed when it was part of the Soviet Union. But this is not something I will talk about today. I will directly jump to the phase of Georgian independence. So I will talk about 1990, 1991. Just to remind you, in the mid-80s, Gorbachev was coming to power in the Soviet Union, bringing some change, bringing along glasnost and perestroika. There was a very significant event in Georgia that you might have heard of on 9 April 1989, which was a demonstration for, let's say, more national sovereignty in Tbilisi, which was brutally, and I need to underline brutally, taken down by the Red Army, with many people who have died, with people who have been gassed, with people who have been killed by a spade, etc. And this in Georgia, this event had a dramatic effect. We can really say that after 9 April 1989, there was hardly anyone living in Georgia who could imagine a future of Georgia within the confines of the Soviet Union. This was not clear, right? I mean, by that time, 1998, there were signs of secession. For example, an entity that used to belong to Georgia, which is called Abkhazia, which was part of the Soviet Republic of Georgia, wanted to secede, wanted to gain independence. There was also Nagorno-Karabakh. So there was already quite some turmoil, and there were clear signs of countries heading for national independence. I would say that in Georgia until 9 April 1908, independence was not necessarily the ultimate goal for everyone who was critically engaging with the Soviet Union. But after 9 April, it became the case that, as I've been saying before, most people in Georgia, most Georgian citizens really couldn't see their future as part of the Soviet Union anymore, which means that the independence movement was gaining momentum, and ultimately Georgia declared independence on 9 April, so same date, 9 April 1991. But already before 1991, Georgia was to a certain degree self-independent, and it was involved in secessionist wars with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Okay, so now let me turn your attention to this region I've been introducing. So let's come back to the map. It's a highland region. Interestingly enough, geographically speaking, it is located in the North Caucasus already. So the geographic definition of the North Caucasus is where the rivers are running towards the north, and of the South Caucasus where the rivers are running towards the south, right? So Georgia is part of the South Caucasus because rivers are taking this direction. And in the north part of the Caucasus, they are taking that direction. And if you go to Tusheti, you have to transgress a mountain pass, which is almost 3,000 meters, and which geographically indicates the border between the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus. So it's quite a remote region that, historically speaking, has very close connections to the North Caucasus. That's something I extensively write about in my book, but here I can only mention it. Yes, so we have this region here. And something was happening in 1990, 1991, and this was the resumption of cattle theft and burglaries. And I'm saying the resumption for a reason, and this reason I guess I need to explain. So we are talking here about a situation of remote villages in the mountains. And there have been very frequent cases of attack from villages located in Dagestan or Chechnya on Tushetian villages and vice versa. So the Tushetians have not been only the poor victims that have been attacked by their neighbors, but they have themselves been involved in raids to the northern neighbors. And usually it was about cattle theft. It was about stealing cattle. But also until the 19th century, it was also about stealing people and selling people into slavery. That was huge. And cattle theft and burglaries, at least, have still been an issue in the early years of the Soviet Union, so in the 1920s. But with the establishment of Soviet sovereignty in Georgia, these cases really came to an end, right? So we could say that for the most part of the Soviet history of Tusheti, there was no mutual cattle theft. But then in 1990, 1991, such cases were happening again. And this is also due to a very particular settlement pattern among the Tushetians. Tushetians are so-called transhuman. I don't know if you are familiar with the term transhumance. It means usually it's about pastoralism, right? It's about cattle. In the Tushetian case, it's about sheep husbandry. It means using the summer pasture in the mountains in the summer and winter pastures in the lowlands. So people commute between these regions. And that is something Tushetians have been doing over centuries. And the consequence was that, and I'm not going to go into detail here because it's about the Soviet days of Tusheti, that most of Tushetians were residing in lowland villages for most of the year, and only in the summer villages, only in the mountain villages in summertime, which meant that for most of the time, Tushetian villages in the mountains were abandoned, or there were not many people around. And this was seen as an opportunity by people residing in the North Caucasus to raid these houses. And it, of course, directly reflects the situation of the Soviet Union by that time, because the Soviet Union was in a situation of dissolution, right? And the consequence was that military or policing activities at the border, controlling the border, were almost impossible to carry out. So people perceived, something like a state of anarchy. And for some, this was a welcome opportunity for raids. So stuff was happening, and Tushetians were confronted with these cases, and they were considering how to react. And interestingly enough, I would say they came up with two strategies. One strategy was about border patrol. And that is something that Tushetians have been doing in the past as well. Although they have never been formally integrated into the Kingdom of Georgia, they nevertheless worked as border guards in a way, who were preventing military invasions from the North Caucasus. That were quite frequent, and maybe you have heard of Imam Shamil, who was a powerful resistance fighter and military person in the 19th century, and he has raided lowland Georgia. But in order to raid lowland Georgia, he and his army had to go through mountainous areas such as Tusheti. So Tushetians, in a way, were doing a job for Georgian statehood, and the job was border guarding, we could say, military border guarding. And they were resuming this on their own initiative in 1990, which means, by that time, as I said, the Soviet Union was in a state of dissolution. There was hardly any state support. So they said, okay, we need border guards, and it can only be us. And by that time, they didn't even have, no equipment, no uniforms, but they started actually selecting some people who started to patrol the border. And interestingly enough, after the state of Georgia declared its independence in 1991 and consolidated in the early 1990s, Tushetians got acknowledged as the first official border guards. So it's kind of interesting, because here we can see that border patrolling or border guarding can be enacted from below, which is exactly what the Tushetians did, right? So as we talk about border, there was a security concern, let's say, and people said, okay, we need to take this concern seriously, and we need to guard the border, and it's going to be us. That's one thing they did. But the second thing was not about keeping the border closed, but rather about transgressing the border by getting in touch with counterparts from the North Caucasus. What do I mean with that? So they were representatives of the Tushetian community. And by that time, they were still organized in councils, right? Soviets. I mean, the literal translation of Soviet is council. This is very much the idea of a council organization. So they had councils. Interestingly enough, also these councils were quite consistent with previous forms of political organization in Highland Tusheti. I mean, formerly these were mainly elder men who were representing their families and who treated themselves as equals. So the council somehow fulfilled the function of representing Tushetian community by men. And they were looking for their counterparts for such councils in the North Caucasus. And in the North Caucasus, such councils existed as well, with a slight different framing. namely a religious framing. Such councils were and still are called Jamaat, and they are mosque communities, but they equally consist out of male representatives of the communities. So what Tushetian diplomats, folk diplomats, did is they were trying to identify representatives of the Jamaat in those villages where possibly the perpetrators were coming from. And they did. They managed, to find these people and to meet these people. Unfortunately, during my field work, I could identify quite some interesting documents. So there were letters exchanged between the Sabjo and the Jamaat in two directions, and there were also protocols of the meetings they had. So all this is documented in my book. And actually, I mean, they were coming to an agreement, and the North Caucasian representatives agreed that these raids and these, cattle theft cases needed to stop. And they said, okay, we are going to tell our community to abstain from that. And everybody was swearing on the Quran, that they will take care of it. And then they said something interesting. If we still do not manage, then let the robbers be punished by state law. So the state only comes into play once, in a way, community relations fail, which is quite indicative of a certain understanding of the state, I would say. So this action was not absolutely anti-state. It was not like we don't want to have anything to do with the state, but rather the state is a fallback position. If we fail, we bring in the state, but only if we fail. So that is something they did to a certain degree successfully. Now to provide a bit of, some optical impressions of the setting here. This is a picture of a Tushetian village called Darklo, right next to the border to Chechnya. And you can see these towers. And these are defense towers. These towers have been approached by families that have been attacked by such kind of raids I've been previously talking about, right? So if Tushetian villages were attacked by Dagestanians or Chechens, people were hiding in these towers. And we find such towers on both sides of the border, so also in Chechen and in Dagestani villages. It's also reflected in the architecture of the main settlement of Tusheti, which is called Omalo, and which is divided into a lower part and an upper part. The lower part is this one, which has been mainly developed by the Soviets in the 1970s. And the upper part is this one. And we have a castle here, which looks like this, right? So you can also see the castle as an opportunity for the local population when they were hiding themselves in case of attack. So we can say that the whole region, the architecture of the entire region is very much saturated by conflict. Okay, so this is the first phase of shifting border regimes into Tusheti that I wanted to talk about. Now, there is a second phase, which has been triggered pretty much by the Second Chechen War. Now, let me ask the audience, are you somewhat familiar with the Chechen Wars? I mean, the post-Soviet Chechen Wars. I can provide a bit of background. I don't want to go too much into the details here. So there have been two wars fought between Chechnya and Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and they have been initiated by Chechen attempts for independence. There has been a first war in the early years of the 1990s that has pretty much ended with the victory of the Chechens. And in the mid-90s, they were independent to a certain degree until in the late 90s, Russia resumed its warfare on Chechnya. And this was pretty much the occasion that was used by a formerly not so well-known politician named Vladimir Putin to gain prestige and to secure power. So he was pretty much the one behind the Second Chechen War. Yes, so what does it have to do with Georgia? So Georgia is bordering Chechnya. And there are certain areas in Georgia, in mountainous terrain, that are somewhat connected to Chechnya. One such place is the so-called Pankisi Gorge. And the Pankisi Gorge is inhabited by Muslim people who have formerly, probably in the 17th century, migrated from Chechnya to Georgia. So there are historical links. They still share the same language, and there is a certain proximity. And the effect was indeed that in the early 2000s, with the war in Chechnya, Chechen fighters were taking refuge in the Pankisi Gorge in Georgia. And Putin was threatening to bomb Georgia because he said that Georgia couldn't really take care of security issues by itself, and that Chechen terrorists were hiding there. So people Russia is in war with. So they were, you know, threatening Georgia with bombardments. Now, Georgia by that time didn't want it, of course, and Georgia by that time was already strongly aligned with the West. And with the support of the United States, with the so-called Train and Equip program, they were, and I need to be brief here, they were reinstating sovereignty over these renegade territories. And that also affected Tusheti, because it means that the border between Tusheti and the Russian Federation, and there is a border between Georgia and Chechnya, was really sealed by that time, right? So the 1990s, as I said, was a phase where on the one hand, Tushetians were patrolling the border, but on the other hand, they were mutually engaged in negotiations and also trade relations, right? So it was an ambivalent border. But in the 2000s, it turned into a real hard border. And it's been the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, that was monitoring the border. So this is a picture I've been taking during the time of my field work of such a helicopter. So they were monitoring the border, but also increasingly they became important as local employers. The OSCE, they've been employing locals. They also had a medical camp up in the mountains that could be used by the locals. So in a way, they were taking over state functions in the sector of healthcare provision, right? So that is something I cover here as outsourcing of social security from a Georgian state perspective. Okay, that was the third, the second phase. Now the third phase. This phase I call the spiritual fortification of the border. Okay, what do I mean with that? And let me use an example. So when I did field work in the region in 2006, 2007, I came across a mission that was sent by the Georgian Orthodox Church from the lowland. By the way, in the region, there are no Orthodox churches in the region of Tusheti that are still in use. There are 4, 5 such churches that have only been built in the 19th century by the Russian administration, but religiosity in Tusheti is of such kind that it's not 100% identical with Orthodox Christianity. So from a Georgian Orthodox Christian perspective, there is a need to missionize these regions and to kind of, teach the citizens of this region how to be a proper Orthodox Christian, which in their understanding also equals how to be a proper Georgian Orthodox citizen, right? So they were coming to Highland, Georgia, for example, to conduct baptism. That was something I've been witnessing and documenting. The mission has been led by quite an influential bishop who has been giving a couple of sermons also during services. And one project he was advocating, and he explicitly called it the spiritual fortification of the border, was the erection of a monastery in an abandoned fortress in Tusheti. So this fortress used to be village that has been completely destroyed in the 19th century because of attacks of Imam Shamil, who I've been mentioning previously, right? So it's very close to the border of Chechnya. We can see a cross here, which has been erected already in a way to demarcate some spiritual sovereignty. And the plan of the bishop was to erect a monastery in situ. Now, that hasn't happened since. There is no monastery since, but there are some other cases at other parts of the border in Georgia where such kind of spiritual border fortification has been taking place. For example, in Sarpi, at the border from Georgia to Turkey, where on the other side, on the Turkish side, there is a mosque, which is not really visible on this picture. There has been a church recently erected. Or, yes, here we can see it. So we have a mosque here on the Turkish side, and the church is right next to this kind of modernist architecture. So yes, it's a sign of symbolic, religiously connoted border fortification and demarcation, we could say. Similar things also happening at the border, the main border between Georgia and the Russian Federation. Actually, the border that has been used by all those tens of thousands of refugees from Russia who were leaving their country after the military attack on Ukraine. They were all using this mountain pass. And very close to this border post, there has been erected a monastery complex, right? Yes, so this is what I call the spiritual border fortification. Now, based on this, I would like to differentiate three models of the state that have been enacted in these various periods. I would say that, first of all, the period of border patrolling and diplomacy from below is a period where people had a federalist version of the state. So the idea is somehow that Tusheti as a region can be part of Georgia and is, of course, perceived as part of Georgia by Tushetian citizens, but a kind of particular part of Georgia that can, to a certain degree, set its own rule and that has a certain degree of autonomy. So the idea of an entity within an entity, the idea of sovereignty, which is not exclusive, right? Which is a classic federalist model, I would say. Now, in the second phase, we have a prevalent model of the state, which is in a way pragmatic, right? So we need to secure the border between the Russian Federation and Georgia because of security concerns, because of Russian threats to bomb Georgia. But also, in a way, this was used in a neoliberal way by the Georgian state to outsource certain obligations that it would have to fulfill within the welfare sector. And finally, we have a centralist model of the state, which I've been formulating already in respect to, being a Georgian equals being a proper Georgian Christian, for example. Having one center of power, not many centers of power, means administering Tusheti from the political center Tbilisi and from the ecclesiastical centers of the seats of bishops that are responsible for administering the highland region of Tusheti with seats in the lowlands. Yes, I think this is pretty much what I wanted to say. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to receive some questions and comments, of course.
Thank you very much, Florian, for this interesting presentation and the visual material as well that make us feel a little bit a part of this landscape. I will open the floor for questions. I can start by using as comparative framework the situation here in Greece as it was documented ethnographically, related mostly with your first phase. these attacks, as you describe them, and the conflicts and the stealing of ships between communities. And I was wondering, and I would like to ask you, how this stealing and the negotiation about stopping the stealings and the conflicts also created, and if you like, try to erase as well boundaries of the everyday life. For example, in relation, for example, to gender. I'm thinking about the work of Michael Hersfeld in Crete and the stealing of ships there and the manhood, all these stories. Or the issue of leadership, political leadership and status, and how this stealing and these attacks could benefit certain families or not, and how this activity could be beneficial to local lords and how they're connected to the center or not. And also how this periphery, to set as periphery, is connected to Tbilisi and beyond.
Thank you, Eleni. Very important questions. So first of all, when it comes to the connection of Tusheti to Tbilisi, or in a broader setting of Tusheti in the past and Georgian statehood, right? And centers of economic life and political life in the Georgian lowlands, it's really important to stress that it's quite ambivalent. And it's important to stress this because there are some very simplistic representations in anthropological literature about communities consisting out of state refugees. So whom I have in mind here is James Scott, of course, who has been writing a very interesting book, but also a controversial book that he calls, how does he call it? Oh, I forgot the title. But he is dealing with the mountainous areas in Southeast Asia. And he says that contrary to our understanding that in these mountainous areas, there are some kind of autochthonous populations, right, that are residing in these places for such a long time. Scott argues, which is called An Anarchist History of Highland Southeast Asia also. So it's an attempt to write an anarchist history. So for him, this remote region is mostly populated by state refugees. So people who have been running away from slavery, from conscription, from plagues, right? And we can see very similar things also in the Caucasus Mountains. And that is something I've been tracing myself, that actually this population of Tusheti, but also of the neighboring regions, Pshavi and Khevsureti, quite significantly consists out of refugees. So, for example, in the 5th century, people who were refusing to convert to Christianity, they were hiding there. Or, people who were escaping from serfdom, etc., etc. So to one extent, we have a kind of antagonistic situation where we have these who were never, subduing themselves to the sovereignty of lowland sovereigns. Right. So also in, after the Middle Ages, they have never been paying tribute to, feudal lords. Right. So they have never been serfs in a way. At the same time, and this is important, and this brings me to your question, there have been very close relations. I mean, one very obvious relation is related to economy. And I've been mentioning already sheep breeding, and sheep breeding to a certain extent, once you pass a certain threshold, means you need markets, right? So you need markets in the lowlands, and you need to exchange products. And for Tushetians, this was important, to gain access to fruits, for example, salt, wine, later on, of course, also money. So trade has been quite intense. And interestingly, we could say that sociolinguistically speaking, Tushetians have been bilingual. So, I mean, they have their own particular dialect of Georgian, Tushetian, but they also, they are very well versed in Standard Georgian. And the important thing is they don't mix these two modes of speaking, right? So it's not, talking a standard language with a certain accent, but rather using two very distinct ways of speaking, and one being Standard Georgian, right? So it also means that, it reflects this ambivalence. They had their own sense of community captured by Tushetian dialect, but at the same time, they were part of the Georgian, linguistic community by being perfect speakers of Standard Georgian. So that's one thing. Also, I mean, I mentioned, that militarily speaking, they were serving Georgian kings and princes because they were protecting the border to a certain degree. And in exchange, they received grazing rights in the lowlands. It's also very important. I mean, I talked about, sheep husbandry. I talked about the need for pasture land because pasture land in the mountains is scarce, right? So in a way, we could argue that Tushetians did some kind of job for the feudal lords in the lowlands, and they received something in turn, which in a way, I would say, turns them into conditional citizens. And this is, I think it's the conditionality which has been in the forefront for the Tushetians in the 1990s. Yes, we are Georgians, but we are conditional Georgians. We claim a certain sense of sovereignty. For example, also there is this idea that Tushetian soil should belong to Tushetians only. Not only that foreigners are not entitled to buy land in Highland Tusheti, also this is ruled out for lowland Georgians. So there is this particular sense of sovereignty, but sovereignty not in an exclusive way, right? And this brings me to your first question, these mutual rates and animal husbandry and sheep and stuff. And I remember that indeed by that time I've been reading about Crete and I've been reading Herzfeld and the gender dimensions, and mutual rates that create something that we could call antagonist sovereignty, maybe, right? It's people fighting themselves, eventually killing themselves. And Tusheti, by the way, and the neighboring provinces, it was very brutal. I mean, up to the early 20th century, they were cutting the heads, of those people they have been fighting with from the neighboring villages and adjacent villages. And Tushetians were showcasing cut off hands at their houses. So, visitors of Tusheti were completely shocked to see all these cut off hands actually at the houses of Tushetians. So it's antagonistic, yet at the same time it's also mutual, and of course it's heavily gender. How to say? I mean, it has a very strong gender component, right? Which, well, to a certain degree, ascribes the status of women as the status of cattle, which can be, stolen and sold or consumed. This is, I mean, I'm just going to add a last sentence here. It's very important to keep in mind because we could, to a certain degree, talk about these mountain communities as egalitarian societies, right? Because they did not have a centralized seat of authority, no statehood, no center of power, no king, right? But rather councils, etc. So we find traces of egalitarianism, which is why people like Scott are so fascinated by these remote places and, uses them to think about anarchism. Oh, this is great, but, if we exclude the gender dimension, we exclude all the violence, actually, which is very crucial to the maintenance of this egalitarian politics.
Yanni?
Okay, I was looking for the hand to raise even when you stopped, Florian, but I couldn't find it. Thank you very much for the presentation. And for me, particularly in these period of time that I am writing also a monograph about the Greek-Macedonian border. I'm very much into this whole, discussion and also the reading of other case studies about border. And well, I'm just trying to somehow prioritize my questions, not to really take much of the time. One of the things that I was wondering is, okay, to what extent, maybe you could tell us a little more. I mean, you practically mentioned this kind of interplay between local societies, communities, whatever this could be, with the state, either the Georgian state or the kind of implications the Chechen War had, with the involvement of Russia. You also talked about, and you showed us this picture of this helicopter. So I was wondering, to what extent, if and in what contexts and cases do we have this intervention of the international, factor playing a role there, and how this is taken into the local society and the local discourses, and how all this interplay might evolve? This could be one of the questions. Maybe I'll get back later. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Yanis. This is a great and very evocative question already, and I'm looking forward to your other questions as well. Yeah, the helicopter, I guess, is a very evocative picture, and it signifies and captures quite well the extent of presence of something else in the local community. Now, what is really fascinating is that already in Soviet times and nowadays as well, one of the best helicopter pilots in Georgia are Tushetians. So that is not something I really developed, in detail, but I think it's interesting and indicative of a certain way of appropriating something which is flying in, right? Which is not perceived as something alien, but rather treated in a way that could be incorporated. I think it's very much about the incorporation of something that provides a certain sense of sovereignty. And that became pretty much impossible in the last phase of border control I've been talking about, when sovereignty is in a way exclusively claimed from certain, loci of power, right? Military power, political power, etc.
Thanks. I could continue if there aren't any other hands.
Yeah, you
Eleni, if you give me the
Yeah.
floor.
You can.
Okay, one other thing of group of questions I have is that, okay, you had to somehow, confine in the time limit, and you focused in the specific things we heard, but you had, certain mentions, and I'm pointing more to this kind of cultural exchange and interaction. You were using, for some part of your presentation, the orientation of Tushetians towards Northern Caucasus. And my understanding was that you're referring to Chechnya or, the areas across the border. And I'm wondering also, we know that for sure from the study of borders and border regions that despite the existence of this political, institutions which divide or pedagogize people to think in terms of, dichotomies, historically, all these societies that did not understand borders as we understand them with a nation state, they all had certain ways to cut across and create, borders, symbolic, cultural exchanges, etc. How is the situation there in your field?
Well, absolutely, Yanis, and again, very important observation. And By the way, I would be super interested in the border between, Greece and Macedonia in this respect. So, what I think in Tusheti and adjacent parts in the Caucasus plays a significant role are sacred sites. And these are shared sacred sites. And the interesting thing is that even now, when we have clear-cut, in quotation marks, boundaries of religional confession, with predominantly Muslim in the North Caucasus and Christian in the Georgian case, at least. Religious practices of people related to sacred sites are pretty much identical or very, very, very similar, irrespectively of this denominational, ascriptions. So this is about sacrifices, about animal sacrifices, about lighting candles, about circumambulations. And there are places in the Caucasus, in Georgia, actually, that have a reputation that formerly they used to be shared among Muslim and Christian populations. So not only that their practices and beliefs are very similar, they used to have places where they were coming together, right? I mean, this is something we know from the Balkans as well. There is quite some vast literature on shared sacred sites. This is why, by the way, we have been working on this project on sacred sites for a certain while, and Eleni has been so kind to mention one of those books we have. What's it called? Well, it's on sacred sites in the Caucasus, and especially in these mountainous areas, they are very important and provide at least, relations from Tusheti to the North Caucasus that are at least, as tight as the relations to the Georgian lowlands. Yeah. If I have some more time, I can show you a picture of one such sacred site and tell another story. But I mean, if there are questions, I can wait.
I think you can show us a photo.
Yeah. Okay. So I will show you this thing. Okay. Can you see that picture?
We
And it's
see
a bit of
a
a
picture of church and shrine with Dartlo.
Yes, exactly. And it's a bit of a bizarre picture. So I need to explain what you see here, right? So you see a ruined building, and this ruined building is a church that has been built in the 19th century. I was mentioning in passing that under Russian administration, because Russia incorporated Georgia into statehood in the 19th century, and they have been commissioning the erection of some churches in Tusheti. Now, apparently, these are ruins, right? So in Soviet times, people have not been visiting these churches, unlike other places in Georgia where people, by clandestine ways, were visiting churches or at least taking precautions that the churches wouldn't be ruined. Now, here we have a ruin. And here we have something which you can, not really see. It's a stone. It's nothing spectacular. But the stone marks a shrine. So, there is a founding myth which associates the stone with a spirit, with a benevolent spirit, which was a founding spirit for the community. And the belief here is really a bit syncretist, we could say, because the idea is that the spirit turned into the stone. So it's not that the stone represents the spirit, it is the spirit to a certain degree, right? So this place here, which is really not impressive, optically, but this is a place that people, Tushetians, have been visiting during the entire Soviet period in summer times, and they have special festivals for that, right? I mean, they bring sacrifices, people are initiated there. This is also the place where formerly refugees have been integrated into the community, right? So they are really the center of community. And this picture is very interesting, and here's my story. So I told you about the church mission that was sent to Tusheti during the time of my fieldwork. They also, wanted to hold a church, what's it called? Service in this abandoned church, right? And they were calling to the locals and especially local women to attend the church festival somewhere here in these ruins. But okay, so these places, the shrines, the so-called shrines, are again, highly gendered and discriminatory, So there is this idea that women are well, poisonous and dangerous because of menstruation, and they shouldn't come close to these places. They would pollute these places, right? And when the church told to the locals, come along to our service and bring along your women, that was causing a big confrontation within the society, right? Because people said that, okay, it's not only the church and the ruins of the church, there's also the shrine. And this is not where women should go to. So this is where things were really clashing, right? And when the Orthodox Church was trying to claim sovereignty, and it succeeded to a certain extent, because I mean, of course, Tushetians are not uniform, right? And especially some women feel kind of, denigrated by these patriarchal customs, right? So they were not hesitant to follow the call of the church. So yeah, that was a bit of a long story to address, Yanis, your question regarding, places and practices that relate to Shettians, as I said already, at least as much to their neighbors to the north than to their, co-citizens in the Georgian lowlands. What about, I mean, the borderlands between Greece and Macedonia? What about sacred places and shared sacred places?
I guess you're asking me.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yes.
The issue of religion is not that strong. I mean, the difference, because primarily, well, Greece is supposed to be a Christian Orthodox country, and the dominant idea of citizenship, as you mentioned, in North Macedonia is again that we are primarily Christian Orthodox. So the issue of sacred places is not, I mean, doesn't have the same, contextual as you described. I think the border and the issues are there more related to the language in terms of tensions and bordering regimes. I'll just stop here. I mean, next Monday it's my turn to talk.
I have a question. One is draws from what we are discussing with Yanis. I was wondering about the other side of the border and in relation to religious practices and orthodoxies. So, okay, the Orthodox Church is trying to missionize, as you said, the area. What about the other side of the border? Is there any conflict between local traditions and the Orthodox Islam and the Orthodox practices in Islam? And the other question also goes to the slide and this church. You mentioned about baptisms. So I wonder if you have any info about who is playing the role of the godmother and godfather. So the symbolic kinship and the networks produced there.
Yeah, great questions. Absolutely wonderful. So when it comes to the North Caucasus, it's not quite my field of expertise, but there I would say the tension mainly plays out between Sharia and Adat, right? So it's not that they are, absolutely exclusive, and it's not that this is a very new debate. It's been strong in the 19th century already, and Sharia also played a significant role for uniting people in their struggle against the Russian conquerors, right? I mentioned Imam Shamil, for example. So Adat is quite particular, and there are, regional variants, etc. So Adat is customary law, right? So Adat is very much what in a way it relates to these sacred sites that I've been talking about, which also in a way is compatible with these micro-diplomatic relations I have been elaborating, etc. And Sharia is taking a more uncompromising stance, but of course also tries to link people in the North Caucasus to larger Muslim communities. And this is a huge issue, of course, in Chechnya, right? I mean, Chechnya is one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world. And Kadyrov, the leader, he himself, embraces traditional Islam, which is the Adat version of Islam, because any form of dissidence is automatically associated with radical Muslim Sharia, Wahhabi, interpretations. So it's a highly politicized issue. It's not, so it's not the very same debate as we can observe in Georgia, where we have attempts by the Georgian Orthodox Church to, in a way, claim sovereignty, over all those quote unquote dissident practices in the Georgian peripheries. It's rather something that really intersects communities in the North Caucasus, and which is a very delicate affair. Baptism indeed is really, really super interesting. It's also interesting, and that is something I haven't mentioned yet. So I have spent quite some time with Tushetian shepherds. And I was part of what they call a brigade, which is a name that they have adopted from Soviet times. And interestingly, such brigades can be quite international, let's say. I mean, what is always clear is that the owners of the sheep are Tushetian, but they hire herdsmen that can be Muslim. For example, ethnic Azerbaijani people or ethnic Kist people, the one who live in the Palkisi Valley. And as I've been spending time with these people, and I became friends, to Muslim shepherds and Tushetian shepherds and stuff. And at a certain stage, I was asked by some brigade member to become the godfather of his child. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details here. So that, in a way, allowed me or offered me a glimpse into how baptism works in this multicultural and inter-religious setting. And the thing is the following. So there can be baptisms, cross-religious affiliations, but the sovereignty is always very clear. A Christian godfather, a Christian godfather can have a Muslim godchild, but not the other way around. Right? So it creates bonds of solidarity. And yes, indeed, I mean, people really care. Once you have, I mean, not that I would have to explain to you, right? You all know very well what kind of implication godparenthood has. So it's serious. It creates bonds, across Christian and Muslim communities, but it also clearly reinscribes hierarchies.
If there isn't any, I could ask one last question, at least from my side.
Yes, go ahead. I have another last one as well.
Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
Excellent. It's very interesting. Florian, you said that this research took place within this research group about boundaries and citizenship from below. So if we want to somehow bring in the concept of citizenship at that time, or even today, how does it fit? What does it tell us about the situation there? And how is it received, embraced or not by the people and the agents, the social agents there?
Yeah, that's a big question, as you can guess, right? I mean, my starting point also to do fieldwork in Tusheti was this very stupid but very widespread perception, this very romantic perception of, oh, these guys live in very remote places and they have sheep and they are completely detached from the state, which is, of course, absolutely not the case, because especially in Soviet times, sheep husbandry has been centrally organized and people have experienced the state and developed certain expectations and preferences that are really, I mean, significantly shaped, not least in respect to the Soviet state and the Soviet variant of the welfare state, right? So something I was trying to elaborate among the example that I shared with you today you know, is something how eventually citizenship can go wrong, as I was calling it by that time. So people do something, they engage, and in anthropology generally we seem to like engagement, right? We want to see people being engaged and, you know, agency, and to increase the scope of their agency, which is what Tushetians did in the 1990s. Micro diplomacy, military, you know, border policing, etc. But then with the taking over of larger entities, their agency decreased. So citizenship can be a fate sometimes, right? And to me, it was important because we are looking at citizenship, or we were looking at citizenship from below, which exists, and it's very interesting, and people do have agency, and not everything comes from the state and is dictated from above, you know. But then again, in certain historical contexts, people really reach their limitations, and they experience, you know, larger entities such as the state or so, in ways that significantly, you know, circumvents their agency, I would say. So that is something that made me think about how citizenship can also go wrong.
Okay, I also would like to ask you about tourism and how, because the last time I was in Georgia in August, I was seeing how these mountainous regions are connected to festivals, pilgrimage, and and I know colleagues from France, for example, that they are running a program that they're very interested in this kind of religious tourism. So I'm thinking how these people address the issue of tourism. Um, how do they embrace it? Do they express fears regarding what tourism could do to their area, their landscape, their traditions? Do they try to be part of this cultural heritage of Georgia, and how to promote it globally?
Yes, very important question, and very, very crucial issue, maybe the most important issue for Tusheti nowadays, which is tourism. Because Tusheti, after Swaneti, is the second most popular mountainous region for tourism. It's still a bit difficult because of the road that is going up to Tusheti, right? There is a road only partially paved, and the BBC called it the most dangerous road in Europe. So, which is something in a way preventing mass tourism so far. So it's more kind of attracting, you know, courageous people or individual tourists or so. Yet it's happening. And I would say that to a large extent, Tushetians embrace tourism. But again, it's interesting here to make a comparison to Swaneti, this other popular mountainous region. In Swaneti, you know, people with growing tourism were quite often giving up previous forms of economic activities, right? Cattle breeding, agriculture, kind of, you know, becoming quite dependent on tourism as the main source of interest. Whereas in Tusheti, it's more integrated. And one example is this family that I spend so much time with, because they also have sheep, and quite a significant amount of sheep. So they are the one who are running the brigade I've been part of. So since I've been doing field work there, 3 sons have been taking over the brigade. They are now in their late 20s, I would say. And their hut is close to Omalo, which is the regional center. So they are, you know, taking care of the sheep. At the same time, their mother is running a guest house. And some of these, you know, brothers are offering their services to Tusheti. So they take them on horseback, for example. They work as guides and stuff, you know. So it's in a way, it's integrated, right? I think it's quite delicate because it could, you know, take over any time. It could turn into something else. But so far, it's relatively integrated and relatively appreciated, I would say.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we can wrap it up here. Yanni, do you agree?
Yes, yes, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Florian, for tolerating us and answering all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Interesting.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Florian. It
Thank you.
was so
Take care.
lovely to see you again. Bye, dear. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Hope to see you soon.
So our next meeting is next week, next Monday, with a presentation by Yannis Manos. And the title, Yannis, is?
And then it's Pausanias Karathanasis about the case of Cyprus.
Case of Cyprus.
And you're going to talk in Greek or in English?
It's going to be in Greek. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
So I wish you a good presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Florian.
you.
Take
Thank you
care,
very
everyone.
much all. Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice evening.